Hi, everybody. Sorry about the technical difficulties, but I'm glad you guys got to look at my inbox for like 5 minutes. It's nothing embarrassing, strictly professional in there. Okay, so today in my 2 talks today, I'm going to talk about a problem in philosophy of science more generally, but that appears a lot in causal inference. And so a lot of my talk today will be a mix of some philosophical stuff that might be less familiar to you guys, and then some causal inference stuff that might be more familiar to you all. And the talk on Friday will be much more causal inferencing and using like the potential outcomes framework, and today I'll kind of set up some conceptual groundwork. Okay, so the big question I want to ask is, is how does the kind of the syntactical, how does formal notation, syntax, and the formal frameworks in causal inference themselves inflect our causal inquiry and our normative inquiry? That's like a really big question, and I'll try to get a grip on it over the course of these 2 talks. But basically, I want to ask how notation itself, how the structure, the formalisms that we use affect the way that we conceive of our causal inquiry and our normative inquiry. So my talk is going to be a bit circuitous, but I hope it won't be confusing. So I'm going to first introduce a problem, which is I'll call a problem of sameness and difference. That basically the question is, what is it for 2 things to be the same? What is it for 2 things to be different? And I'll show how that difficulty leads to a difficulty in variable construction in our data and statistics that gets elided oftentimes in formal work. I'll call this the problem of variable construction. And then I want to show you that this is indeed a problem for you if you work in causal inference or stats, and that if you fail to grasp the significance, it's going to mislead your inquiry, your causal inquiry, and any kinds of normative conclusions you might draw from your causal inquiry. And then, insofar as oftentimes our causal inquiry is trying to proffer kind of evidence for the normative judgment, so we're either trying to, let's say, in the vein of prescriptions for what we ought to do, like policy-wise, or maybe we're trying to detect causal patterns to make some sort of that are morally significant in some way. That failure to attend to this problem is going to be a problem also in establishing those normative conclusions. So this is a tutorial talk in the sense that some of what I'll cover will be basics in my field. I work in the philosophy of causation and social and political philosophy. But then also what I'll be doing at the same time is setting forth a challenge to what I take to be the basic orthodoxy, both in my field and in yours. And if you can't detect which is which, then I'll really have done my job. Okay, so the first is the problem of variable construction. So as far as moral prescriptions go, Aristotle's dictate to treat like cases alike is rather unarguable. As a principle of formal equality only, it's empty in substance until the relevant respects of likeness are filled in. So people are not alike or unlike in just some pre-theoretic way, since no 2 concrete actually existing people are identical in all respects. No?
Sorry. I forgot to ask you what's your about questions.
No questions, just kidding. Questions throughout, so please interrupt. So no 2 actually existing people are identical in all respects, no 2 actually existing things.
Oh,
did you have
questions?
No, okay. Are identical.
Sorry, I changed something.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll do it later.
The camera's on us.
Yeah, the camera is on us and it's actually not showing, so it has to be on, otherwise it doesn't show correctly.
Okay.
That's what I was trying to change, but I can't find the.
Look, I think the control bar might be, if you go take the mouse up to the top of the screen.
Yeah.
No,
It's not doing it. That's what I thought too. Oh, maybe we need to get out of the view.
Not there.
Perfect. So then it's perfect. Then yeah, perfect. And then I can hide it again. Sorry about that.
Oh, yeah, no problem. Okay. So no 2 concrete actually existing things are identical in all respects. Oh my God. Wait, what is happening?
Resume slideshow.
So resume slideshow.
Yes.
To this thing?
Quite a bit.
No.
Oh, yeah.
Top left.
Resume slideshow. Okay. All right. No two things are exactly alike and unlike. All of us are alike in some senses and unlike in other senses. So we're all alike, for instance, in the sense that we're all at this workshop right now or today. And all of us are unlike in the sense that we all are occupying distinct spatiotemporal patches. Okay. So this makes simply just cataloging a list of likes and unlikes like a non-starter in terms of figuring out how to make use of the similarity principle, right? Because there are going to be an indefinite number of ways that we could catalog likes and unlikes. So we have to decide what makes two persons alike such that they ought to be treated alike. And this kind of makes the principle, you might think, kind of empty or circular, which is what makes like cases alike. Well, they're the ones that we should treat alike. Okay. So we need to do some sort of normative theorizing and determining what people, for instance, are owed given various characteristics, given the context that they're in order to know how they should be treated. And then it seems like once we add this principle, it's just kind of a principle to be consistent or something like that.
Sorry, we're talking about like epistemology now, or are we talking about things like fairness and
I will normative theorizing in the sense that when I'm trying to figure out how you ought to be treated, so in any sense, then I have to figure out what the relevant senses of likeness are. So it has to be fit in another
but
sense.
it's about justice or about knowing stuff, or
It'll be both most of the time, right? Because I'm trying to figure out, I'm trying to dole out some sort of treatment to you, right? And so I always have to make a determination of what constitutes what the kind of rule is. So in that sense, the rule is going to be, has a normative quality because it's going to be something that is not about what is, but rather kind of a choice that I make, right? So, but it will be around.
So it's treating in the sense of treatment of the causal inference.
Yes, treatment, and there'll be treatment, and there's always going to be normatively inflected because I have to make determinations about relevance that are not kind of just descriptively out there in the world. I have to kind of pick out those that are salient to me, and they might be salient in terms of justice reasons or salient in terms of like other reasons. Okay. So these are kind of basic, banal observations about formal equality. And they're often criticized because on the grounds that they are empty or circular or require these antecedent normative judgments, right? They're kind of empty. For that reason, and I have nothing to add on that, Mark, I think it's indisputable that we can't bootstrap a principle to treat similar people similarly into some substantive account of how to treat them without adding more premises into the mix, right? But I want to point out actually a rather opposite risk of these principles when they're used as a guide for thinking about, say, what fairness requires, or say what we should do in some sort of randomized control trial or something like that. Which is, rather than being empty from the perspective of action guidance, it seems like they're actually dangerously easy to operationalize in the formalisms that we have. Its easy application is actually a result of the notation itself. So I'm going to try to make this argument, which is that it seems like a principle like treat similar people similarly is empty in content. It's not guiding at all. But I think when we have that principle in mind and we're using it in stats, causal inference, whatever, machine learning, whatever, it's actually dangerously easy to operationalize because of the formalism itself, because of the syntax of the formal frameworks themselves. Okay. So it's a really so this is kind of a naturalization. We tend to naturalize likeness. So I emphasized in the beginning how likeness is something that is, you know, innumerably things are alike and unalike in many, many ways. We have to choose the respects in which are relevant. But when we receive kind of data out of the work from the world, random data collection efforts, we tend to naturalize likeness. Okay, I'll walk through that more slowly.
But it seems like at the heart of how we think about causal inference, always we have observables and unobservables, and we always think that everything's heterogeneous in terms of the unobservables. So
Yes,
that's
yes.
built into the framework.
Totally, I will get to this. Okay, so maybe we're at the part where I'm saying banal things for now. Okay, so it's a point that's really obvious, but it bears reminding, continuing registering, reminding ourselves that the raw materials from which all of our inference is conducted are built from data whose fundamental shape is set by the construction of variables in variable sets. So data always arrive in a definite form. So they cut the world into these particular slices and chunks and tranches, and that make assessments of similarities and difference look really straightforward. So I like using age as an example. So two people, if your age groups are 18 to 24, 25 to 34, and so on, it looks like two people who have the same X1, let's say, are more similar than people who have different X1 and X2, even if that means that someone who's 18 and 24 will be marked as more similar than someone who's 24 and 25, just because of the way that we've chunked up that data, right? So And it seems natural to say that people who are common in more X values are more similar than people who have more dissimilar X values. That seems natural to say. It seems natural to say that if Max and I have all the same X values except for some value Z, that we're the same except for the respective Z, right? It seems natural. This talk is peppered all over in discussions of similarity in causal inference, especially. But this is, of course, to make something of a reification fallacy, where the model that we've constructed to represent some state of affairs is eclipsing the state of affairs itself, right? So claims that seem true as a matter of how some model is constructed, or claims that are true in a model relative sense or a variable relative sense, are taken to be just true about the actual state of affairs. So just take my example about Max and I being in the same age tranche. It looks like we're the same age because of the way that I've set up age tranches, but of course that might not be the case. And so, well, let's start from a kind of simple proposition that X, yes. Go ahead.
Sorry.
Yeah, go
Stop
ahead,
me
please.
if I interrupt.
Yeah, sure, no.
But I guess usually I would think of this as being like a measurement of variables being combined with something like random sampling. And with random sampling, if two things are more similar in terms of the observables, then the unobserved distributions are also more similar.
Yeah, so that is definitely an assumption that's frequently made. I guess I want to say that there's a lot of heavy leaning on what it is to say that a variable is observable versus unobservable. So oftentimes I don't know whether people mean that it's unobservable in the sense that I haven't recorded that fact about you, or whether it's unobservable because it's impossible to record such a fact about you, like intelligence or something like that. And even this distinction about observable and unobservable kind of selects certain ways of dimensions of likeness and features of that I want to problematize from the start, right? Maybe we'll get to more of this as in the talk.
But it's interesting, like that random sampling is an important conceptual layer to add to this.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, and I guess, yeah, maybe, and please feel free to bracket or ignore, but I guess just building on something Max said a little earlier, I do think that in the formalism of causal inference, usually the idea, even right, in some sense, a lot of the focus is exactly on the idea of sort of unobservable heterogeneity and sort of heterogeneity on dimensions that we either, right, to your point, there's a distinction between haven't measured versus can't measure, but in some sense, heterogeneity on both of those. And for instance, on things like individual level treatment effects, we sort of know as a theorem, we can't measure them, right? And so we can't know, even if we know that people are similar in all observable dimensions or even potentially observable dimensions, they may be unobservable on others. So in some sense, I guess the setting things up as interpreting xi equals xj as sort of, we're saying that the units are the same, feels to me like a bit of a departure from what the framework is doing.
Yeah, so I haven't talked about causal inference yet.
Okay.
I'm just talking about just variables. So I'm just talking about, I'll move on to causal inference. Hopefully it'll be clear so we're just talking about how to demarcate similarity and difference in two abstract things. But once we get to causal inference, hopefully some of these problems will be addressed. Though what I want to say is, even saying that they're similar in observables is a bit opaque to me. Like, I'm not sure what that means, right? So say I've recorded age. What does it mean to be similar in age, right? Okay. And oftentimes this will appear in causal inference because people will be like, oh, well, there's overlap in my data. Overlap means I have the same support, across the two different kinds of treatments. Well, what does that mean? That just means that in the recorded data, there is overlap. That means just in the X covariates, I have support across all the same. So it's not the case that this doesn't bear on questions and assumptions that are made in causal inference. Or positivity assumption, for instance. Again, it's about observable covariates. Okay, covariates and okay, but I'm not talking about causal inference yet, so I want to put a pin on that. Okay, so we know that then, as everyone has anticipated, it can't mean that I and J are exactly alike, as we've talked about, because that just can't be true. It's just that I and J are alike in some ways, captured by X. Even that, I think, that depends on what the features X are meant to capture, as I've used with my age example. And I want to, what I want to press on today is just that we can't just have the x's be indexing anything of similarity, because any two things, I can choose some set of x's on which we're identical in some respect. So it has to be that the features that are captured in X are somehow relevant to the question at hand. Again, not talking about inference yet, but causal inference yet, but just that it must, hopefully, in order for this not to be trivial, I have to hopefully think that the X's are capturing covariates of interest in some sense, whatever that means. Yes.
To draw to a different action, but I think that's exactly what Jan was talking about in the second half of his talk, right? Is using these additional covariates in a fully randomized experiment as a way to increase precision by asking the expert to which covariates are actually relevant.
Yeah, good. So
predicting the potential outcomes.
Yeah, great. Okay.
Sorry.
Yes.
Just to clarify, relevant here could mean relative in a normative sense.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about like similar fact evidence in criminal law, where there are certain facts that the jury is not allowed to see. They might be highly predictive, but from a normative perspective, we don't want them to be taken into account. So that would also be good.
Yeah, fantastic. Right. So and I'll
Yeah,
totally. And I'll get to that. You're anticipating some of what I'll say. So, okay. So the question is, the problem of variable construction then is, how should we construct variables, or how should we record x's, construct variables, or carve up reality, or put forth a description of something to appropriately capture what's significant in a given system or a setup, and in order for us to A, do science, and B, pursue our normative aims. That's the question, right? So once we realize that we're going to often want to make statements like xi equals xj, and we want them to capture the relevant kinds of similarities, our task becomes, what are the kinds of features out there in the world that will capture the relevant kind, that won't glom on to kind of irrelevant similarities and irrelevant differences, which there are always an innumerable number of. So that's the problem of variable construction. All right, and I'm going to now do an interlude on causation. So a lot of you in the, yes.
Sorry to interrupt. So this variable construction, are you thinking
Yes.
of it? Can this data be repurposed, or is it tied to like a particular task and the particular investigation that you want to do, which is the relevant types? Because in machine learning, we often like repurposing data for all types of like.
Yeah, good. And this is a general question in the philosophy of science, which is like, it seems like in fields, in what some philosophers of science will chauvinistically say, like in like developed fields of science, they have good choices of variables. It's like we have a good periodic table of elements. It's like it's pretty good to sort things in terms of, I guess, what the periodic table of elements tells us to do. That's like a good way of pursuing chemistry. It's a good way of doing physics or something like that. Not physics, chemistry. And it seems like we can use the periodic table of elements, the variables that are set forth there, to do all sorts of different kinds of things within chemistry. And we don't need to develop like a different kind of periodic table for like specific tasks in chemistry. So there's like an open question, I think, in the social sciences, whether that's the case, whether there is kind of a periodic table of variables that'll be good kind of across particular inquiries you might have in the social sciences, or whether it might be that in the social sciences, because it's not well developed or whatever that means, there might be different sets of variables that are apt for different kinds of inquiry. Don't myself have a dog in the race, as it were, but it seems like people tend to think that there are some variables that are seen to be explanatory across different kinds of inquiry within the social sciences. So like you probably use categories like sex or race across many different kinds of inquiry, or income. Those are seen to be explanatory and not only kind of relevant in like narrow senses. Okay, so this is an interlude in causation. So a lot of you probably work in causal inference. And I want to today show how the problem of variable choice is a problem that you have to contend with in your work if you want to do sound inference. You probably knew that, but I want to maybe be more specific on that. And now obviously causal inference is famously ground zero for some of the hairiest, longest running, most personally vitriolic methodological debates I've ever heard. So whether you're Team Rubin or Team Robin or Team Imbens, whichever causal dude you back, I think that I can describe am I forgetting somebody? I think I can describe the kind of core idea that you have about causation which is basically a broadly interventionist picture of causation. So I think that regardless of which of these guys that is your fighter, that you're probably subscribed to something of an interventionist picture of causation. So I'm just going to go through that. So this is dominant picture, I think, not just that undergirds most statistical frameworks, but also is like dominant in the philosophy of causation as well. So, and the picture here is that X causes Y just in case it's possible to intervene to change the value of X, so to change the value of Y, where intervene is a technical notion. Yes.
Sorry to go back to the battles of the previous slide, but I thought Pearl was questioned this, but perhaps I misunderstand the landscape, and that he'd say that you don't need causal variables to be manipulable in order to discern.
Yeah, so I haven't filled in the content of what intervention means, right? So it could be that it needs to be an actual intervention that can be, in fact, practically executed, but it need not be. I could say it just needs to be a logically possible intervention, or it needs to be a metaphysically possible intervention.
Right.
Yeah. And that would be more Pearl. So people might dispute the inner workings of this word, and that will hopefully not be an impediment to moving forward from this broadly interventionist picture. Okay, so what is an intervention? So X and Y here are just variables that characterize some feature or component of this causal system under study. What's an intervention? It's often said as an exogenous manipulation. It doesn't need to be in fact enacted. Exogenous manipulation of some causal system that makes a change to the value of its target variable, and crucially leaves unperturbed the state of all the other causal factors on scene, unless they go through the intervened variable, such that any change that results in the outcome Y can be traced back to the causal influence of the intervened upon variable. Okay, and then people will disagree about what constitutes a surgical intervention, but that's the general idea. Yeah. Okay.
Oh, sorry, there's one left.
Resume slideshow.
Great job.
Okay, so the image of divine intervention gives an intuitive picture of things. So you have God swooping in to some state of affairs at some designated time t, and it's with surgical precision that he changes the variable, as let's say X here, leaves everything as pristine. He kind of swoops out pristinely, exits, lets the passage of time take over, and then we check at some later time t prime what's going on about Y. Okay, if we see a change in Y, we say X was causally relevant to it. If we don't, we say it wasn't. And the more kind of prosaic idealized controlled experiment in sciences is another helpful gloss, right? So we imagine this idealized experimental setup. We ask, does performing an unconfounded manipulation on X result in some change in Y? And we need to make sure that the manipulation on X is unconfounded. This is crucial because if it were confounded, it would muddy the experimental waters, and I wouldn't know whether it was X doing the job or some other X prime I accidentally touched on my way. Okay, so what's a variable? We don't need to kind of get too philosophical about it. It's just some sort of determinable of some causal system that takes a determinant, which corresponds to its values. They really can stand in for this is, again, most methodologists think this for really any property of the system. The only constraint here is that the values of the variables have to be mutually exclusive. So the variable can't take like two of its values at the same time. And then so long as the variable can value, and it has to be, oftentimes people will say exhaustive, it's not clear what that means, but so long as such a variable can vary its value, it can be a cause or it can be affected by a cause. Okay. Now notice that what constitutes an intervention depends on two things. It depends on first what the manipulation does to its target variable X and what it doesn't do to the other causal factors that link up to Y. So we have from the arch interventionist here, James Woodward in philosophy, he says, good variables are well-defined targets for single interventions in the sense that they describe quantities or properties for which there's a clear answer to the question of what would happen if they were to be manipulated or intervened on. I mean, Pearl might disagree, but one obvious rationale is that to the extent the requirement's not met, a representation employing these variables will not provide answers to questions about what would happen under interventions, blah, blah, blah. And then we would fail to provide information about causal relationships. So I hope that this picture of causation looks familiar to all of you who work in the causal inference world. Okay, so return to this. Notice, after all, if we say that an intervention is an unconfounded manipulation that makes a change only to its target variable X and leaves everything else as is, then we need to have an account of sameness, right? What it is to leave everything else as is. As we've noticed, there's just an infinite number of ways that things can be the same and different. And so this is a non-trivial problem. We have to construct variables that will carve up the world, that will track conditions in a way that will identify when the relevant parts of the system are the same and different. And yes.
So maybe just as a translation, I think like in statistics lingo that shows up as like measurement error and treatment variables, right? Like you have measurement error, then you have attenuation bias or things like that.
Yeah,
It's
good.
like a cause and effect.
Yeah, so I don't know exactly how to think of measurement error, but sometimes I'm not clear about what the truth conditions of a variable are. So in order for it to be mismeasured, it must be the case that there's like a real truth condition and then there's like a mistake in some sense. And sometimes I'm not clear what the actual truth condition is. So this is the most, in my work, this is kind of comes out most saliently in the perception of race. What does it mean for you to have perceived it correctly versus for me to have mismeasured that you have perceived it? So mismeasurement has to, presuppose correct measurement. And so I
was just trying to make it.
okay, great. Sorry, Max. Yes.
If it reminds me a bit of a question of whether a well-conducted randomized control trial forms a valid IV.
Yeah, great.
I always debate. Is that right?
Yes. So the IV is supposed to kind of cut off.
You rule out other channels other
Exactly.
than indulgence therapy.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah, I guess just to sort of as a concrete example, would another example of this be, I think I'm conducting a randomized trial of a job training program.
Yeah.
And I'm going to look at the difference and say, this is the effect of job training. But in fact, as part of that job training program, I'm having you drive to this place where you spend 2 hours a week. I'm having you do this thing. I'm having you be enrolled in it versus not being enrolled in it. And in some sense, I'm calling it the effect of job training.
Yes.
But in principle, like any of those other things could also be a source of difference.
Totally. And maybe you've defined your variables such that it's part of the job training. Like job training also constitutes being away from home for 2 hours or something like that. Or we can carve it up more finely and say there's job training and there's other thing that's changing, and maybe that's irrelevant. Maybe I'm saying like that's an irrelevant difference, just like there are all sorts of irrelevant differences. Or maybe I think that's a relevant difference. But again, that decision about whether it's relevant or irrelevant has to be made against some background kind of what would constitute relevance and irrelevance for the question. Great. All right. So we need to have a theory of variable, an approach to variable construction that's going to allow us to identify the relevant parts of the system that have changed or have not changed. And remember, this is the problem of variable construction, and it's not a practical problem or an empirical problem or an epistemic problem. It's a conceptual problem, right? Because what we're trying to do is narrow down from the infinite number of things that are similar and different, the ones that will matter for our causal system. And so to pursue causal inference, before we do anything else, we have to theorize what constitutes an intervention of a system, which is a change here that would introduce no other relevant changes. And so the question is, what vectors of relevance matter here? All causal inference that rests on an interventionist idea has to first solve this problem. Yes.
I have the sense that this part of your discussion really doesn't need to be about the social sciences at all. It could be physical science, could be spaceships, could be, moving asteroids.
Spaceships, yeah. Yes, absolutely. But it seems like the question about what similarity and difference has been under-theorized in the social sciences. So I have a lot of quotes. I'm just going to do one. A lot of times we're describing things as things are being treated differently when they're otherwise the same, or they're otherwise identical circumstances or identical characteristics in similar circumstances. Okay. And so my question, I'll keep referring to this. The question is, what's the notion of similarity and difference that's at play here? And how is it operationalized in various kinds of experiments or in various kinds of causal inference methods? Okay, so some examples. I'm going to start with some fanciful examples as a philosopher to kind of bring out the problem of variable of choice. This is a really silly case. Has anyone ever seen me give it before? I'm very proud of it. Okay, it's called Polish versus Polish. It's going to be a case where a bad choice of variables will lead to mislead inquiry badly. Okay, so suppose I'm interested in how people react to two sets of memos I give them. You might see where this is going. We can think of it as a randomized controlled trial. I give some of you guys a memo of type A, and I give some of you guys a memo of type B, and I want to know, how does capitalization pattern or something affect your reactions to my memo? That's a totally fair audit study. So I write these two sentences on my memos. I give one group A the first sentence and I gave group B the following sentence and I choose my variables in the following way. I just record a variable recording the letter, the alphabetical letter that's represented in the stylization pattern that's represented in each letter entry of the memo. And I say, I've done an intervention on the capitalization of the letter that's in position 12 of my memo. And this will tell me what the causal relevance of capitalization or stylization is on people's reactions to my memo. And of course, it's true at the description of these memos. But the only thing that's different in some sense is the symbol that's printed in the 12th position of the line. One is a lowercase p, the other is an uppercase p. All the other variables recorded according to this way of chunking up the variables are identical. There is, of course, another choice of variables, the one that I expect you all as competent speakers and readers of the English language would think is more natural for this, which is to track not just the alphabetical letter and the stylization of the symbol in each entry, but to chunk up the sentences of the memo into words rather than letter entries. This is, of course, in some senses, a coarser way of doing variable construction. And it just doesn't, and moreover, it doesn't seem that this is just a different way of carving up the world. It seems like this is a better way. This is an improved variable choice. The second choice of variables is an improvement on the first one. It doesn't just, it sets me up to do better inference on the conclusions of my experiment. It better captures, it seems, the true nature of the similarities and differences in the experiment. Yes.
So just continuing with
Yeah.
my translation exercises.
Yes, love it.
But it seems to me like this type of example would tell us that wouldn't really change anything in terms of internal validity of
Good.
causal inference, but it would kind of imply a different extrapolation or a different sense of external validity, or how we would think about what would happen in other instances of
Yeah, but
capitalizing the 12th letter versus capitalizing Polish.
sure. The internal validity, though, you have to say, like, what's the cause? You know, it's two different causes, right?
I mean, steeple 1 versus steeple 0, whatever that means, right? But
Right. But it's valid as a causal effect of, in the first case, the capitalization of a 12th p. That's valid, internally valid, and it's internally valid here. And you're just saying what's distinct is that
But
the first.
example 2 would be the exact same thing in both cases. It's just how I would extrapolate to new instances would be quite different.
Yes, certainly that's the case. But so what you're saying is, if I did the internal validity of the first, let's say I run the experiment, I think of the variables this way, D0 is giving you a lowercase p, D1 is giving you an uppercase p. In both cases, we can say that I did the inference, the internal validity is the same across the two and only the external validity.
And in some ways, the external validity is maybe all that matters here, but
I want to be like cagey about this, because what I want to say is it's not even clear if the internal validity is true, because it's not clear what it would mean to say this is the causal, what is the causal effect of. So D0, D1, like, you know, it's a causal effect of presenting people with a small, you know, I need a fuller description of what the treatment is in each case.
in some sense, the type like kind of like a serious example is a job training.
Right here, and I think in this external is another way to sort of put the point that you're making,
Yeah.
basically, just that I could mean different things by internal validity here.
Yeah,
Right,
good.
because I could mean sort of if what I say by internal validity is just if I sample another group of trial participants from the same population, show them these two sentences, randomize who's getting what, am I estimating the difference it means from doing that? It is
Yeah.
internally valid in that sense.
Yeah.
However, if I say for this group of trial participants, what is the effect of capitalizing the 12th letter in a generic sentence that
Yeah.
is not internally valid? If I sort of say, what's the effect of capitalization in that population, that is not internally valid in
Right.
that sense.
Exactly. Yeah. So describing what the internal validity is, like what is internally valid is also non-trivial, right? We have to kind of, in order to identify that the first is true and the second is not, requires kind of pre-theoretic work, right? So I think even saying that this achieves internal validity is a non-trivial claim. Okay.
Slideshow, I'm afraid.
How did I know?
I didn't.
Okay. And causation, and I don't want to get into this, but like, I know internal validity and external validity are really like terms of art in some sense in your world, but it seems like part of why we're interested in causal inquiry or interested in the causal structure is what I do in my experiment. I was talking to Isaiah about this. What do I do in my experiment with these two populations? I have to think that what happens in this corner of the world is kind of replicated in other parts of the world. Otherwise, there would be no point to calling it a causal inference, right? There's a regularity in causation that's assumed to not just be like a one-shot kind of dependency relation that obtains here in my corner of the world. What makes it causal is that it's kind of robust regularity, maybe, that appears in other parts of the world. And so in that sense, something that never has external validity anywhere we would be really loath, I think, to call that explanatory or causally explanatory. Yes.
When I was trading the markets as a quantitative trader, sometimes researchers would find correlations of this sort. Of course, there wasn't really the same prediction, right? I didn't expect causal effects, but I was always really uncomfortable about trading a correlation that had appeared in the past. I didn't have further reasoning to give myself confidence that that would continue into the future in similar ways.
Right, exactly. And people. One thing that separates out correlation and causation, you might think, is that you can kind of have a lookup table of all the correlations in the world, right? And causation can't just be like different kinds of listings of that entry of the book of the world. It seems like causation, in order for us to say something like, remember, correlation is not causation, it has to be something more, right? So claims that external validity never holds, let's say, seems to undermine that causation even applies. But that's a very heavy.
A counterpoint would be that's just a useful way of carving up the overall problem of making causal predictions in new instances into these two parts, so we can meaningfully talk about one and then about the other in some sense.
Yeah. So maybe the causal claim is just a restricted claim about this population here. Yeah, right. Okay. Oh my goodness. All right. So I want to say that it's not just that this is a different way of maybe carving up variables, but it seems like we can say something stronger. This is a better way. Inquiry is guided more fruitfully in this experiment or this choice of variables than the other choice of variables. I have a couple other examples, but I'm gonna move past them so that I can talk about audit studies. As you know, I love audit studies. So we're going to return to this. What does it mean to treat? So here, what are Bertrand and Duflo talking about? They're talking about cases where we're using various kinds of causal methods to detect discrimination. So now we're moving into the kind of moral political realm of things, where we're saying here we define discrimination throughout this chapter as members of a minority group, women, blacks, Muslims, are treated differentially, less favorably, than members of a majority group with otherwise identical characteristics in similar circumstances. So this is appearing in the Handbook of Economic Field Experiments, where they're discussing how to design a good audit study. Or this is kind of the guiding light for a good experimental study. Now, the question is, how is the notion of difference and identical being operationalized in an audit study? That's the question here. And though what I'm going to say is I'm going to walk through a case of an audit study. Remember, I'm talking about the interventionist ideal of causation that undergirds most all causal inference. So insofar as the audit study, the RCT, is taken to be the gold standard, it's going to apply to other methods too, like observational, causal inference observation day, maybe you're doing matching stuff and so on. All right, so here's an audit study. Does everyone know what one of these is? It's kind of these are like classic quasi-experimental setups, where what I'm doing is I'm sending out, in this case, this is a classic resume audit study or a correspondence study, where I'm sending out matched pair resumes that are sent to employers that are looking for hire. So each pair is going to be made up of a black candidate and a white candidate, black candidate. There are no actual candidates that are matched or otherwise very similar in the other contents of the resume. So we have Greg and Jamal here that are applying to jobs, the resumes that are identical, but for race. So the logic of the study is that the difference between the rate at which Jamal receives callbacks and the rate at which Greg receives callbacks is going to give the causal effect of race, because I've intervened to change only the name. That's the thought. So all of this changes the race signifier or the name. And the difference is going to give the causal effect of race or perception of race or perception of racialized name and so on. Nothing else could have been the difference maker. Yes.
Did you explain why it's called an audit study? Sorry.
Yes, they're audit studies because they used to be used as actual audits. So you would go into like Equal Employment Opportunity Commission would actually go into firms and actually audit the firms for discrimination. And so they would actually do it previously with real live auditors, actors. So there are amazing audit studies of people going in to interview, for instance, and they're trained to behave in the exact same way. These are correspondence studies, so they're supposed to be superior methodologically because they guarantee a tighter match than training actors, the thought is. Although, again, this question of what it is to be a tighter match is a question, but, there are famous audit studies of used car sales negotiations. So you have women and men go and bargain for used car prices, and they're trained to behave in the same way. Again, what does it mean to be the same? But that's why they're called audit studies, yes.
I mean, I guess my issues with a
Yeah,
lot of this stuff, but I think that there is a well-defined sense of what it needs to be the same that this is coming from, which is what it is in terms of the contribution to profits, right? Which is where this whole like taste-based
totally.
discrimination notion is coming from.
Yes.
And it's like, do these two employees contribute to the same amount of profits, and then we should treat them the same?
Yes.
I think it's morally absurd, but
Yeah, no, right. So this is like descendant from Becker. Becker has his economics of discrimination where he's saying, I mean, there's a model where you're assuming that they're identical in productivity relevant characteristics. And because it's a full information setup, the employer knows that, and there's a penalty nevertheless for hiring somebody who is Black or someone who's a minority status, and that's supposed to be the taste, right? So in Becker's setup, we do have this assumption of the knowledge of productivity, identical productivity. Here, we can't do that for all sorts of reasons. But I think there's something like that. We're trying to match them on productivity relevant.
But there's an underlying concept of what's kind of legitimate source of unequal treatment, what's not a legitimate source.
Certainly, yeah, certainly, yes. Okay, and I'll use audit studies as when I walk through kind of a more formal stuff on Friday. So these are the kinds of resumes that are set up that are sent out on these experiments. And there's a certain way of carving up variables that encourages the thought that Greg and Jamal are the same, but for race, right? Because it's natural to code up a variable tracking the name, and then it's natural to code up variables tracking educational background, technical qualifications, whatever, right? So this is the way, the kind of implied variable set that's operating in the background that is justifying the setup of the experiment, right? So to be concrete here, it's natural to select X1, X2, and X3. So we got institutional, that they require the degree, maybe it's some GPA, maybe the most recent job type, whatever. And then it's common to choose Z or some other variable marking race and marking that difference. So X1, X2, X3 are the same, but Z is different. So again, just being really explicit about what's licensing the identical characterization of this as identical but for race. So Greg and Jamal here are identical on a particular way of conceptualizing how we can carve up variables, right, to represent resume contents. But as we've seen, this is only one way of carving up variables, of slicing up the world. We could have sliced them up in many different ways that would not license a distinction, to say, between the race variable and the non-race variable, right? So I could have said, you know what it is to be equal is to group SAT score by national percentile. Okay. By national percentile, by district percentile, SAT by race. I could do SAT by income. Then I wouldn't be able to mark these distinctions between the variable representing race and a variable representing non-race. I got it, old hat, representing the non-race variables, right? So, but this is a one way of constructing the variables. And I'm not saying it's wrong, I'm just saying that it's just important to bring it up. So now I want to consider a case that's structurally the same, but that might give us pause. I'm going to use the same idea about variable construction to construct a case that's structurally the same, but that seems problematic. This one's called legacy versus prodigy, but I don't know whether the word legacy translates in this context, but in the US, if you go to a fancy university, sometimes it's because your parents went there. That's called legacy. I don't know if that's true. Maybe that's also true at Oxford. Okay, so here's an audit study where I'm doing the same thing. I'm giving people resumes. I'm saying they both went to University of Oxford. They both got 3.7s at their high school, but one of them is age 12 and one of them is age 22. So, but with the thought is, well, wait, when I see a 12-year-old having graduated from University of Oxford, I don't think these two people are different in age only, but they're equally academically prepared and skilled and have equal academic potential because GPA delivers information about academic achievement and age delivers information only about how long one has been on the earth. This seems rational. It seems that the right thing to do is to think that these two individuals are not matched on qualifications, that there's a difference in age that has changed the salience of the difference in qualifications, and that therefore it seems to be the case that what's going to be perceived is a difference in the actual substantive merit of each of these candidates. In other words, it seems to think that natural to think that the 12-year-old here is a prodigy, perhaps, and that this bears on how the GPA is going to be taken up by the resume reviewer person or something like that, and that we should construct variables to make salient this difference rather than hiding it. Yes.
We could also conclude that because if a person age, that it's simply impossible for a person age to get that GPA, and that therefore there's something must be false.
Absolutely right, but the point, yes. So certainly, but there's an interaction here, you might say, between the age, oh gosh, and the GPA that is leading us to maybe be skeptical about a variable construction that's going to elide that fact. Right? We don't want to perhaps say something like these people are just identical, identical in all but age. It seems like now they're different in the fact that this seems like a sketchy resume, perhaps a doctored resume, and a fraudulent one, and this seems like an authentic one or a realistic one. And so that marks an important difference between the two that must be captured, let's say, in our data. But that's hidden when we only have the variable choice that seems to be in the background. Yes.
So that may well be to the previous one. So maybe that as somebody from two races, you face a different burden to do this, have the same degrees. So it may well be that in the 1960s, if you were a black man who had a degree from a prestigious university, you were probably smarter than the average white man who had the degree from that university.
Yeah.
So I mean,
no, right. So the point is, if this makes you think, if this setup of the experiment, which is structurally the same, right? All I've done is make them different in age except for race, makes you think that the variable construction is eliding something significant in a significant difference by creating an appearance of similarity, then exactly the lesson is that perhaps a similar thing is going on in the previous example. So I am going to get there. Yes.
I think I want to defend the
Good.
everything the same but for age
Awesome.
position.
Yes.
Because I think there's a bit of a distinction between when we say everything the same, do we mean everything in this block of text is the same?
Yeah.
Or do we mean everything in our perception of these two candidates
Good.
is the same? Because it feels to me like the argument you're making is basically about everything in our perception about these two candidates is but for age is certainly not the same.
Yeah.
But in the block of text, I think I am willing to
Yes.
stand up for the
Absolutely. You are gonna have a great time on Friday because it's exactly on this point, which is oftentimes these experiments are, I mean, everyone who knows the causal inference methodology debate about race has been, the move to perception has been seen as the most effective way to get around questions about manipulability, right? Questions about, so a lot of people do want to go in the perceptions of race camp, but I want to say something stronger, which is that even if you do not go in that camp, you have problems. That is, but also Friday. Yes.
And maybe we slight pushback, like another way of to think about the same thing would be in terms of treatment effects and heterogeneity.
Yeah, good.
Right, like I mean, that we can say the causal effect of age or perceived age is very different depending on whether you have a BA or not.
Yes.
And so maybe not controlling for these things is kind of lumping stuff together that we don't want to lump together, but
yes,
it doesn't make anything wrong in some sense about the inference.
In order for me to know that, I need to know what correct treatment looks like. So oftentimes people will make the distinction between treatment and intent to treat, right? So it could have been like, I intended to treat you. I intended for you to see them as similarly qualified. I intended for you to only see them differently in age. But in order for me to know whether it makes sense to characterize it as a failure to treat, like I intended to treat, but I failed to treat, or a heterogeneity in treatment, I need to know what constitutes correct treatment, right? So it's clear in cases like vaccine trials what effective treatment means. It means you in fact received the treatment, or I gave you a pill and you in fact took it. But what's what does it mean to have you correctly perceive age? What would constitute, in other words, true perception of age or true perception of race? And that is not answered in most of the cases, right? So, you know, if I, for instance, did this, and I'll go into this on Friday, if I get to the study and you didn't even look at the resume and you just like accepted the resume on the left, would that be effective treatment, or would that be a failure of treatment? Like, in order to answer that question, I need to characterize what it is for there to be treatment. Or perhaps in the audit study, suppose you don't have, you sort resumes based on alphabetical ordering. Is that still correct treatment? Is that failure of treatment? Like, again, this goes into the question of what constitutes the variable. What is it for the variable to in fact be set to race? Is it just that you received a paper, or is it that you correctly had a perception? If it's the latter, you need to tell me what the content of the perception is. So perhaps I would read the name Greg, but I am not from the US. I don't even know what that means. Would that still constitute correct treatment? Yes.
Is it useful, like that if this I observe this in various places, that there's a tendency to think that ancillary statistics are independent of sufficient statistics, if that makes any sense to you. So the name, it's irrelevant to anything, right?
Good. Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that it's not informative, taken into in conjunction of the other data. So the fact that the name is irrelevant to anything,
Yeah.
In sort of classical statistical terminology, that's an ancillary statistic. And of course, what you're interested in is a summary of the data into the stuff that is sufficient to make all inferences from, i.e. the sufficient statistic. And that people by and large, you know, quite often this sort of think that, which is true under some circumstances, of course, that the ancillary statistics independent of the sufficient statistic. There's been a bit of discussion of this sort of thing in defining what discrimination is.
Yeah, so I don't know if this will fully answer your question, because I'm not sure what you mean by when you say the name is irrelevant. The name is irrelevant in the sense that it ought to be taken to be irrelevant, or that.
But if all you knew was the name,
Okay, yes.
then it doesn't tell you anything about how good the person is in some sense. Now, of course, it might, but if we're talking about discrimination,
Yeah.
we're going to take for granted that just knowing somebody's name doesn't you know, the fact that somebody's got a black name or a white name. Look, I think we're starting from the premise that doesn't by itself tell you anything.
Yes.
But that doesn't mean that it doesn't tell you how to interpret other data.
Oh, good. Yes. Yes. Yeah, so there's and you can tell me whether, I don't know about this terminology. You can tell me whether later slides get to this, but I want to draw a distinction here between when names should be informing other kind of uptake of other information, as decided by you and me, like as decided by us as a community, as decided by the experimenter, versus the question of when it does, just as a matter of fact, a matter of how people behave in the world, that it is taken as informative. Those are different, right? And depending on what we're doing the study, what we're aiming at when we're trying to do the study, what conclusions we're aiming to draw, whether they be trying to proffer evidence of discrimination, or whether we're just trying to learn something about how people behave, as you know, independent of constructing a definition of discrimination, that you know this will matter differentially. Okay. So now is exactly the point to this gentleman here who's like, I anticipated what I want to say, which is that if you thought that there's something about legacy versus prodigy that stopped you in your tracks and made you think perhaps that variable construction that licensed this audit study wouldn't be as informative, as in it's like the P versus capital P. It's just not a good way of choosing variables. Then I want to suggest that maybe something is the case, might be the case in the Greg and Jamal case, right? What we're trying to do, again, the task of variable construction is to choose variables, get a good and apt choice of variables, construction of variables, that will allow for certain kinds of salient differences to be observed, read off the variables, and salient kinds of similarities to be read off the variables. So as economists have reminded us over and over, people don't just care about GPA and other credentials just in and of themselves. They care about them as signals, right? They care about them as signals of productivity or of qualifications or of merit or so on. And so the question is what GPA might mean for a candidate's diligence or a candidate's preparedness. And that's what makes for a good interpretation of a signal, right? That I should be trying to put together as many different kinds of pieces of information together. And that's a more accurate kind of portrayal of economic or social behavior than one that's just trying to record like facts about writing on a page. Okay, so you might then think something like a different choice of variables might license a audacity constructed like so, right? So perhaps what we want to do is make salient the similarities. There are perhaps differences in their actual SAT score, but maybe we want to make sure that the variables capture the salient kinds of similarities. So similarities that incorporate facts about race, or use larger tranches in our GPA to capture similarities like so, right? So here, what's the different kind of variable choice is licensing an audacity like so, and there are two different interpretations of sameness here. The first is that I want to design my experiment so that Greg and Jamal they will be perceived similarly. In some sense, I want them to be perceived so that I want the subjects of my experiment, so the job screeners, to think the following: these people are equally qualified. That's what I want to realize in my experiment. And the question is, how do I design my resumes to realize this kind of effect? That's one way of designing the audacity, right? And you would have to put different resumes forth in order to do that, right? Just probably because of how race works. Yes.
I was wondering if another adjustment that could be made was going beyond this on venture wasn't. I know this wasn't would be to, even though this might have been a randomized trial, the results of a randomized trial, nevertheless do some propensity score matching on the likelihood of the name being often black or white after the effect. There's a robustness check. Does that make any sense? It asks what experience
I say it doesn't make sense.
I don't think, I mean, in this case, right, so propensity score matching would be what's the probability that the name is blank given observable stuff, which I'm not quite sure I see it here, but I could be missing.
Okay, so one way of setting up the study, which operationalizes a different notion of sameness or equality, is I want to make them similar in perception. So I have to present different resumes perhaps, or I have to change the variables that I use, in other words, to realize the similarity in perception and the perception of qualification versus the perception of race. Another thing I could do is I could set forth resumes that try to enact the following. I want the two candidates, I want to see whether people are perceiving them similarly, given that they ought to be perceived similarly. And I think that this is the real kind of what really licenses actual audacity, which is that the experimenter is putting forth a normative proposition, which is like Greg and Jamal are in fact, they should be treated the same. Not that they are, notwithstanding the fact that you might perceive them differently because you might downgrade certain people's credentials or so on, they ought to be treated similarly. And that's why this registers a causal effect. Yes.
I don't think that number 2 has to be normative. It could be the law says that they ought to be, or the organization says as a matter of policy. Experiments are taking the normative steps, right? Apple Corporation says that that I'm going to get a coefficient of 0 if I run this study. Okay, let's run the study and see if that's right. Then you see what I mean?
Yeah, right. So the one thing is the experimenter could set forth the standard according to which people should be treated. Another is there could be an off-the-shelf policy or a law that you're trying to match, and you're trying to match conformity with. the reason why I was just hesitant is actually in the law. I think people who, I mean, and I have a bunch of hidden slides. I don't know if this shows, but this is, I have 100 slides. And that's because there are 50 slides that are hidden. But I think people think that the law requires a certain kind of standard of treatment that is in fact false. Like the law permits all sorts of irrationalities, at least in the US, like all sorts of irrationality. Like I could discriminate like consistently against people who like mayonnaise, and that would be not illegal, right? So I think that why I'm hesitant is I think that a lot of experimenters or causal inference people think that this is what the law requires, but it's in fact not the case. Yes.
But I also do think, getting back to the previous point, that 2 layers below this is this libertarian conception of
Yes.
what is justice, what profit maximizing companies produce in a competitive market, and that's our definition of distributive justice.
Totally.
This is kind of an indirect kind of encoding of that idea, even if the people who are doing it might have forgotten that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that that's the case. And that's why it's so troubling that this has become the gold standard for causation, because it would be weird that causation is hewed to this like libertarian standard of like what people are owed.
Which is very much, by the way, not what welfare economics would do, right? But it's what a certain branch of economics has been doing.
What a very influential branch of economics and a lot of other fields, sociology, it's not just economics, sociology, political science. Yes. Okay. So given that we could run audit studies like this, I think there's a kind of less conciliatory. Okay.
Slideshow.
Okay. All right. So as a result, original audit studies, I want to say, face a justificatory burden, which is that they have to back up why their notion of sameness is the one that is the right one to enact, right? So then what should we say about the original one? So one response is to say, oh, the original audit studies are fine. You're not getting at what you think you're getting at, because it turns out your study doesn't instantiate an intervention on race perception. And if you want to, and I can't wait to beef about this on Friday, but I'll talk about this on Friday, why you can't just say it's the effect of sending out papers like so. Like that's what I'm going to, as a kind of stronger claim, I'll argue for it on Friday using the potential outcomes framework. So this is kind of more conciliatory, like, yeah, run your studies, you have to face the justificatory burden, you might have to change what your causal effect is an effect of, but it's fine. There's a kind of less conciliatory response, which is that the variable construction that underwrites your notion of sameness is actually defective. It's descriptively inapt given the aims of your study. And it's like the P versus the P in the Polish versus Polish example. It's like the setup in legacy versus prodigy. You have chosen you've made for a poor choice of variable construction that has hidden essential features of difference and in the construction of the variables, and that is somehow kind of wrong by your own lights of what your study is trying to do. You're failing by those standards because you've kind of failed to consider what sameness requires. So I want to return to this, and I'll end it somewhat on that. I mean, this is a kind of let me say some more about what this descriptive error is. It's a rather bold claim, which is that the claim here is that variable choice that's eliding key normative features, which is the fact that Greg and Jamal have faced significantly different life circumstances. That's a key normative feature. It's a key feature of these resumes, these histories, and that a failure to make them salient, it makes for a failure of description, right? So it's a strong claim, which is that in order for a description of a variable selection to be apt, it must capture the normatively salient aspects of the resume in this case. And that if you think that racial injustice is actually an essential feature, then a failure to account for it in your variables makes for an inapt description. So it's descriptively faulty, not just because of how it might affect our future practices, but because the right sorts of description, the right kinds of variables have to also make the right kinds of normative claims. It's a strong claim. I'll say more about it on Friday. So when we set out to offer the right description of the audit study, we don't proceed by simply just picking any set of features, recording any kinds of similarities across Jamal and Greg and any kinds of differences, but we pick those features that I want to say are morally significant for treatment and record them in a way that highlights similarities and differences in those dimensions that gesture at their correspondingly similar and different treatment. And pursuing variable construction in light of these normative aims is what makes a description apt. So it's only in light of the kind of aims of your inquiry, which is whether it's to study discrimination, whether it's to study how people are racist, aside from discrimination, is what makes the variable choice descriptively apt. So remember when we started off with a similar treat like cases alike, we realized that what constitutes correct likeness had to be like kind of defined by what would be apt like treatment. So there was a kind of circularity that made the axiom a little bit empty. But here I want to say if what constitutes apt treatment is actually always going to be normatively defined in light of racial justice, then the description also needs to capture that. Okay, I'm basically out of time. And so I want to say,
Sorry, Max, could
Yes.
we just set the rule that talks have up to 90 minutes?
Okay, they are
they are, okay, great.
75 to 90, I guess.
Yeah, but can we, so I feel like 75 to 90 is confusing because that makes people feel like maybe they should stop at 75. Could we just say 90? Awesome.
Amazing, yes.
I'm thinking maybe it's super narrow to the context of Nathan's paper.
Yeah.
Would it be reasonable to argue that that paper then it's a lower bound on the actual, whatever we want to call it? I don't even know what word to use. Effect of whatever.
Question mark, yes.
Because I'm thinking, if I recall correctly, the actual data set, someone might correct me here, but if I recall correctly, it's not balanced. In fact, I think that names associated with Black communities had higher computing skills, and they were like, oh, but the sign of the variable bias is actually the opposite direction, so I think it's robust to them. So
I don't want to say it's a direction. I don't want to put a directionality on the bound, whether it's an upper bound or lower bound, because part of what's the problem is that this thought that the sameness should be the standard. And let me give like a concrete example of this. So right now in the US, we have this affirmative action case out that's against Harvard and University of North Carolina. And the expert reports are these like dueling econometricians, like David Card versus this guy whose name is Peter Aricionato, who I call Arancini because it's very hard to say that thing. And they're doing the same thing. They're like, I take applicants from Harvard's admissions pool, I match them on academic index, on extracurricular index, on all these indices, and I look at differences in probability of admissions. I mean, they're just conditional probabilities. I look at the conditional probabilities in each of these different deciles. And they're showing that there's discrimination in favor of Jamal, right? Or discrimination in favor of Jamal. Now, if you take the Odyssey as like the gold standard, you would have to say like, yeah, and it's a lower bound whatsoever, or something like that. And presumably you might not, or someone like me, you might not want to say that, because you want to say now all of this methodology is downstream from a very erroneous selection of variables, right? Which is that, yeah, on my view.
But in our view, again, it's like the notion of discrimination is just off, and it's not about them misestimating it, it's just they're estimating the wrong thing.
Yeah, totally. I think that that's what's so curious is like these people obviously agree about how to do statistics mostly. I mean, there's like adjustments about what the correct denominator is, what the correct data set is. But I have no qualms with the estimation technique or statistical ability to crank the statistical machinery, right? The question is whether the S-demand is defined correctly.
But it's like, it's affirmation where we, admit students from disadvantaged backgrounds who have worse grades or something like that. Is that something we want to do or not? And maybe to compensate for historical inequalities.
Yeah, right.
And it's not really about like, have we gotten our variables exactly right in estimating that? But is it defined, do we define discrimination as, we only use the grade point average as the goal?
Yeah, I mean, exactly. I mean, you define discrimination by reference to similarity in GPA or similarity in SAT score, similarity in number of AP tests or something like that. And it's because you define the causal effect by reference to that conception of similarity, right? Similarity in raw scores of these academic indices, that you are able to yield estimates like the ones that they have, or the one that at least Peter Aricionato has. And that's why I don't want to say this lower bound thing, because if I say this lower bound thing, I'm conceding that is the correct standard, only the estimate's kind of off. Whereas what I want to say is that benchmark is actually misled entirely. And so S-demand and all, we got to check it out. Yes.
So,
Yes.
Do in the card, Jean, please.
Yes,
do
thank
they agree on the objectives of the admitting panel? I mean, I remember when I've done admissions, we'd sat there and said that we want to make sure we don't miss any totally awesome candidates, or we're trying to get the best average. We're trying to find people who we can improve the most. So we were actually kind of very unsure about which of these objectives we would often come to the conclusion. It's really some of your colleagues in philosophy that maybe we could still make progress even if we could agree on this question at the outset. I don't know if these two guys
They do.
agree on that.
So maybe this is a matter of legal strategy, but they actually converge on the estimand. What they disagree about is the extent of admitted variable bias, whether to incorporate legacies and athletes and other special admits in the pool that would change the denominator. What kinds of so like whether to incorporate information, new variables like parental profession in the regression. But they agree that they're trying to track similar in all these dimensions, that most of which they agree. There's some that they disagree, and then find the causal effect from there. So they do agree on the estimate, but that might be a legal strategy thing. I mean, yeah. I see.
So, but just feel free to, maybe I'm just missing something, but I guess just thinking about the two the two interpretations, the sort of more and less conciliatory ones.
Yeah.
I guess in some sense, I'm curious, would you, a way I would be tempted to phrase that would basically be sort of, I'm pretty willing to embrace the assumption under which I am estimating the average effect at this point in time for this group of firms of sending out piece of paper A versus piece of paper B.
Yeah.
And then the entire issue is, what relationship does that affect, piece of paper A versus piece of paper B, bear to any question of policy interest, any question of moral relevance, et cetera, et cetera.
Mhm.
And for example, there is work the things you would infer about Jamal's socioeconomic background being conditional on the resume are different than potentially the things you would infer about Greg's socioeconomic background. So like there's stuff in the name other than just race that people could arguably be updated about too. And so all of that's to say, like, I don't think even if you embrace the sort of causal effect interpretation, I don't think signing bias is at all clear. But I guess in some sense, I'm curious, would you agree with that formulation or disagree?
So Friday, but
Yes.
what
I'm excited.
it's when you describe what the experiment is an experiment of. So there's one way, there's a kind of super deflation, the retreat, which is like, I just did my experiment was the following. I sent these firms a resume from this pile, and I sent these firms a resume from this pile. I don't even know what I did. I don't even know what I treated them with. I just treated them with like Rorschach A and Rorschach B. And then I'm reporting results like Rorschach A. People really hated those for whatever reason. I can't even say that it was an effective race, right? I could it's only like things, I can't even say it's the effect of like if I want to do a full retreat, I can't even say it's an effect of a resume. It's just an effect of me sending out, like God knows if they even looked at them, right? So there's a kind of full retreat that I think just completely alienates the kind of purpose of the study from the study, right? From a description of the study and what I thought you were trying to do. But there's also like, what I want to say is like, it's not a problem. Like you don't have to go down that route. Like, and experimenters are clearly drawing on a well of background knowledge in order to run experiments like this, right? So all this debate about whether the names were chosen to be the same. So there's this debate about whether we should have chosen a different distribution of names, because the problem with the selection of names that Bertrand Mullinathon selected was that they were different in socioeconomic status. Really what I should have done, there was all this debate, like when the study didn't replicate, people had charged like, oh, you should have compared Andre with Greg, because Andre and Greg are both perceived to be of the similar socioeconomic status and different only in race. And what did Sendel say? He was like, no, I stand by my choice of Jamal rather than Andre, because the fact that they're perceived as different in socioeconomic status is a part of the effect of race. So he's saying something kind of like conceptual here, right? He's not just making a methodological point about like what names are good names. He's saying in order for me to correctly capture the effect of interest, the treatment of race, I need for it to be confounded in some sense with the effect of socioeconomic status. If I were to deconfound it, that would mislead my inquiry. Yeah.
So I sort of totally agree.
Yeah.
I totally agree with that, but I guess basically the reason I'm asking this is in some sense it feels, and maybe this is just, having drunk too much Kool-Aid, but basically it feels helpful, like too much causal inference Kool-Aid, but it feels helpful to me to separate the sort of, is the issue, are we estimating the causal effect versus is the issue the causal effect of what? Right, and I guess I'm sort of willing to say that sort of under the full retreat interpretation, I am willing to say we are getting a causal effect. And the issue is in the full retreat version, like it's a causal effect of like, right?
Yeah.
And so then we can have a fight about like a causal effect of what,
Yeah.
It does that, I don't know if that distinction.
Yeah, no, that's fair, but so the first thing is like, it's hard for me to get a grip on this. Like, I'm getting a causal effect of something because what I'm supposed to imagine is like God is swooping in and he's like doing something and then he's leaving. And it's like, yeah, I suppose if all you want to say is that there was a difference between A, which is how things were before God intervened, and B, and then I'm just looking at A versus B, it doesn't seem like causal inquiries after something like that. And so I worry that the kind of super retreat view of it's a causal effect of something is just completely at odds with like all of our scientific reasons to do causal inquiry and not just track dependencies, because we can always be tracking dependencies, right? Like conditional probabilities, crosstabs, like we can always be doing that. It's the thought that what makes it the gold standard of causal inference on this interventionist view is that I'm isolating something of interest. And it just is hard for me to motivate that picture of causation when I'm retreating from what the thing of interest is.
I think we almost here
Right.
agree anyway, but the thing in defense of the retreat version, there are things that can go wrong about that too, right? That we should separately be concerned about.
Yeah.
But if I send every resume from pile A to big firms and every resume from pile B to the small firms, then we can say there's something wrong about the causal inference of resume A versus resume B.
Good. Yes.
Yeah.
Right, and that's a relevant question, even if the other question is also relevant, or maybe even more relevant, of how do we interpret what that means.
Yeah. Good.
Or to sort of piggyback on that, like all the sort of, right, any way that people mess up their experiment, dealing with sort of confounding, dealing with messing up randomization.
Yeah.
Many of those apply even in the super retreat version. And
Yeah,
so I
good.
guess it feels helpful for sort of separating this, call it like the pure statistical issue of like, I'm estimating something from the conceptual issue, I'm estimating something I care about.
Yes.
Fully with you that I don't know whether these audit studies estimate something of interest for, say, normative questions.
They do.
That's a huge debate and an important one, but in some sense one that you can separate from the first one.
Yeah. I mean, my own view is that there's no need to do a full retreat. You can just say, you can make assumptions like I'm making the substantive assumption, which is that people will perceive race differently. And I'm making the substantive assumption, which is that as a result, people might interpret GPA differently. Like these are okay assumptions. There's no need to feel that my calling attention to these problems requires you to do a retreat. You can just double down and say, yes, and I intend to make those assumptions, right? Like that's also a move you can make. And so I worry that to do the retreat is also to concede too much, which is that like, it's okay for your experiments to be based on theory and based on assumptions.
I guess my take would be, I completely agree. I'm sort of happy to do, well, in the audit study context, I'm not so happy to defend those assumptions, but there are other contexts in which I'm happy to defend those assumptions. But I guess sort of my take on it would be like, I want to have those fights separately, right? Because like there are fights about just like implementation of the experiment and like, am I even getting like retreat version of the causal effect? And I think I sort of want to have that sort of have that bucket of arguments separately from the bucket of arguments about, and what's the right way to interpret this thing that I'm estimating. And maybe this may just be like a matter of taste or a matter of semantics.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we'll get more into the guts of the problem on Friday, but I think that this idea that I can just do an experiment and then I can separate out the question of interpretation afterwards, that division, I'm more skeptical of that, because I think that anytime you're running an experiment, you know what you're doing, like you have to have some theory of what you're doing, right? And that's the kind of question of variable construction. It's like you're always doing some kind of variable construction. There's no retreat where you're doing no variable construction, right? And so this that makes me skeptical of this full division, where we can kind of just separate what the variables that are constructed design, and then like an interpretation afterwards. Yes.
Yeah, I'm just gonna, I suspect I'm just adding to what you're saying. I was just catching an implication, which is that maybe there's a temptation among scientists to concentrate on one of those two activities much more than on the other, namely the making sure everything's really statistically safe, the retreating in other words, and then not to actually spend enough time actually on and not to know where to go and which forums to do the interpreting part.
Right. And you have to interpret against the background. And so the question is like kind of retreating to look at what the background against what you're interpreting your studies. Yes.
To what extent is it helpful to frame this as a measurement issue? We talked about the relevant similarity of perception, but then maybe we're just not measuring this similarity, the perception correctly. And do you think there's room for like a further skeptical kind of argument where if you don't know like the firm's kind of data generating process or like processes, then it's not possible to capture the perception, and it's not. There are some questions in which you cannot have similarity ex ante, and that's like you cannot estimate some causal questions in this sort of way.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Right. So like when people bring up measurement, what I always want to say is like, in order for me to like, it's like returning to what the truth conditions of the variable are. Like in order for me to know whether I've measured it correctly, I need to know what it is. And so a lot of the question about variable construction is like, what am I even trying to track in the first place, such that I can know whether measurements of that are accurate or not accurate. And in the case of perception of race, I have to have a really substantive and kind of controversial picture of how people perceive race, which is like, in many of these cases, it's like, okay, I perceive race, like it's like I read the name, I perceive race. Then like I move, I like my like eyes scan further down the resume. Then like I perceive GPA. Then like I think race again. Then I re-perceive GPA. Like there's this like schematic of how perceptions work that is not being explicitly aired in a lot of these debates. And once we begin to air them to kind of understand the notion of similarity at work, we might call into question whether those are like empirically plausible, whether people's perceptions do work in such a way such that I can engage in the various isolation intervention like tasks that studies like this are after. But I'll talk more about that also on Friday. Okay, so the last thing I want to say is it's a call to arms on variable construction, which is that when we're doing statistics, we're always starting with some set of data and variables. And so in some sense, experimenters and data collectors have a first mover advantage. Stackelberg game. They move first and they construct a sense of variables from which provide you the measuring sticks that are then natural to conceive of later kinds of analyses. Of course, you can always say there are unobservables. You can always say that, remember, the X's are only capturing certain kinds of dimensions, but there is just a kind of priming bias to think that the variables that you've been handed over are capturing the relevant dimensions. So if we're more thoughtful about how we do variable construction, if we see that as a part of our task, then we can eliminate this kind of perhaps like lack of theoretical clarity from the start. Or not eliminate, but at least reduce. And in the case of when we're studying statuses of social stratification, we might want to ask, how can we construct variables that make salient race as a relational fact that marks social difference, right? So right now, in the dominant ways that we kind of collect data, we have like a column that represents race, which is the race variable, and then we have like the other columns that capture the non-race variables. And so that makes it really easy to say things like, Greg and Jamal are the same, but for race. But in some sense, that's because the data set has made it really easy for you to draw out those similarities and differences. But once you see that variable construction is this very theoretically laden task, we can think, what are the better ways of constructing or chunking up the world, carving up the world to make salient relational facts? So that kind of make it more difficult to make the strict division between the race variable and the non-race variable. Okay. So that'll then allow us to ask the following question, which I think is what the audit study is, how we should interpret the audit study, which is to ask the question: when are different people when are different people owed in light of that different similar treatment? Okay, I don't know why I like Yoda this final sentence here. It should be, when are different people owed similar treatment in light of the fact that they're different? Like, that is a much more difficult task. It requires normative theorizing, but what I want to say is that the variable constructs that we use kind of naturally because they're available to us in our data sets are also, like, in some sense, derived from prior normative theorizing, right? They're just the kind of baseline libertarian, perhaps, background views about what constitutes similarity and difference. And that if we think that variable construction is also a part of the task of statistics and causal inference, then we can ask this other question, which I think will guide for better causal and normative inquiry. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.